page 46. Execution, The Discipline of Getting Things Done, by Larry Bossidy and Charan with Charles Burck. Chapter 2. The Execution Difference. Every great leader has had an instinct for execution. He has said, in effect, unless I can make this plan happen, it's not going to matter. But the selection, training, and development of leaders doesn't focus on this reality. Judging from our observations, a high proportion of those who actually rise to the top of a business organization have made their mark at their personal brand as high-level thinkers. They are the kind of people who get caught up in the intellectual excitement of each new big idea that comes out and adopt it with enthusiasm. They are articulate conceptualizers, very good at grasping strategies and explaining them. This, they know, is what it takes to get ahead. They aren't interested in the how of getting things done. That's for somebody else to think about. Judging a person's intelligence is easy for people who hire and promote others. It's harder to research a person's track record and gauge their know-how about getting things done, particularly when the performance is the result of many people working together. But the intelligent, articulate conceptualizers don't necessarily understand how to execute. Many don't realize what needs to be done to convert a vision into specific tasks, because their high-level thinking is too broad. They don't follow through and get things done. The details bore them. They don't crystallize thought or anticipate roadblocks. They don't know how to pick people for their organizations who can execute. Their lack of engagement deprives them of the sound judgment about people that comes only through practice. 2.1. The trouble with Joe. Joe, the CEO whose downfall we described in Chapter 1, is a typical leader who didn't know how to execute. Let's take a closer look at his story, along with those of two prominent CEOs whose companies failed to execute the leader's grand visions. You'll recall that Joe couldn't understand why his people hadn't delivered the anticipated results. He'd brought in a top consulting firm to design a new strategy. He made several acquisitions and had a great relationship with Wall Street. Based on his deal-making skills and acquisitions, the company's price-earnings ratio shot up in less than 2 years. Joe's strength lay in marketing and customer contacts, but he also had a good, close relationship with his CFO. Joe set stretch goals, and the CFO handed the numbers down to the operating people. No micromanager, Joe left the details of implementation to his direct reports, including the executive vice president for the North American business unit and his director of production. But Joe stayed on top of the quarterly numbers. If they came up short, he was on the phone immediately with the people in charge, telling them in the strongest terms possible that they needed to shape up. The quarterly reviews were less than civil. By the standards of conventional management analysis, Joe did all the right things. By the standards of execution, he did almost nothing right. The gap between goals and outcome reflected a chasm between Joe's ambitions and the realities of the organization. In fact, the goals he set had been unrealistic from day one. A major problem was that the company's plant could not build enough of the product because its managers were 12 months behind schedule in implementing a process improvement plan that was 12 months behind schedule. Joe didn't know that. Though he chewed his executives out when they didn't make their numbers, he never asked why they didn't make them. An execution-savvy leader would have asked that right away. Then he would have focused on the cause. After all, you don't fix a problem just by looking at its outcome. Was the installation of the process on schedule? He would have asked. Did the executive vice president and his director of operations know the reasons, and what are they doing about it? Like many CEOs, Joe believed it was the production director's job to ask such questions, and the executive vice president's job to make sure they were asked. But, again, like many CEOs, Joe hadn't picked the right people for the right jobs. Neither man was much on execution. The executive vice president was a ticket puncher who moved almost every 3 years from one job to another. The production director was a highly intelligent finance guy who came from a consulting firm and was regarded as a high potential candidate to succeed the CEO in 5 years. But he didn't understand operations at all and was acerbic. The plant managers reporting to him didn't respect him. If the leaders had had an open dialogue with the manufacturing people, they might have learned about the manufacturing obstacle, but that wasn't in their makeup. They just handed the numbers down. Furthermore, while stretch goals can be useful in forcing people to break old rules and do things better, they're worse than useless if they're totally unrealistic, or if the people who have to meet them aren't given the chance to debate them beforehand and take ownership of them. How would Joe have behaved differently if he had had the know-how of execution? First, he would have involved all the people responsible for the strategic plan's outcome, including the key production people in shaping the plan. They would have set goals based on the organization's capability for delivering results. Organizational capability includes having the right people and the right jobs. If the executive vice president didn't know how to get things done, Joe would long ago have coached him on what he needed to do and helped him learn how to execute. If he still wasn't making progress, the only option left would have been to replace him, as the new CEO who took over did. Second, Joe would also have asked his people about the hows of execution. How, specifically, were they going to achieve their projected demand on a timely basis, their inventory turns, and cost and quality goals? Anybody who didn't have the answers would have to get them before the plan was launched. Third, Joe would have set milestones for the progress of the plan, with strict accountability for the people in charge. If they were installing a new process to improve yields, for example, Joe would have made an agreement with them that the project would be X% completed by Y date, and that Z% of the people would be trained in the process. If the managers couldn't meet the milestones, they would have told him, and he would have helped them take corrective actions. Fourth, Joe would have set contingency plans to deal with the unexpected a shift in the market, say, or a component shortage, or some other change in the external environment. Joe was very bright, but he didn't know how to execute. The people who hired him saw nothing in his record to indicate he'd fail because they did not use execution as a selection criterion. His reputation for deal-making and for making savvy acquisitions had earned him the job. When the board fired him, it brought in a management team that knew how to execute. The new CEO came from manufacturing. He and his team reviewed and discussed the hows with plant managers, set milestones, and followed through with discipline and consistency to review them. Pag 50